In the winter of 1943, as the North African campaign reached its most volatile stage, Allied intelligence analysts working out of a makeshift operations room in Algiers quietly opened a small canvas pouch recovered from a destroyed German convoy. Inside, they found something unusual: private letters written not by an officer, but by a simple driver assigned to a senior commander known only through the cryptic abbreviation Rmml. At first glance, the letters seemed mundane: daily accounts of fuel shortages, shifting routes, and mechanical repairs. But as the analysts read deeper, the tone darkened. The words offered a rare window into the fear mounting inside the Afrika Korps as Allied pressure closed in from east and west. The driver identified himself only as K, signing each letter with a hurried initial. His writing was straightforward, lacking the bravado common in many soldiers' accounts. He described long days spent behind the wheel of a battered Opel Blitz truck, navigating the scorched supply roads between Gobes, Sfax, and the interior strongpoints supporting the Mareth line. But beneath the routine mechanics of military transport, K revealed something else: a creeping sense of dread. He wrote of constant strafing attacks from the RAF's Kittyhawks, of convoys scattering for cover among dunes that offered little protection, and of the unnerving silence from headquarters about the worsening situation on the front. To understand the driver's mood, one must recall the broader context. After the defeat at El Alamein in November 1942, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army pushed relentlessly westward. The once confident Afrika Korps, under General von Arnim and the remnants of Rommel's forces, found itself squeezed between the British on one side and US forces advancing from Algeria and Tunisia on the other. Supply lines that had already been stretched thin were now collapsing entirely. Every mile of road became a target. Every depot risked destruction. For the men tasked with moving vital documents and senior personnel, the danger multiplied. In one of his earliest letters, dated February 3, 1943, K mentions transporting Rmml to a command post outside Medellin. He notes that the commander rarely spoke, keeping his face buried in dispatches, but those brief glimpses he caught showed a man increasingly strained. His hands shook when he read the latest reports, the driver wrote. I pretended not to notice. The analysts who first transcribed the letters couldn't confirm the identity behind the abbreviation, but the details matched movements of several senior staff officers known to operate behind the front at the time. The struggle escalates in later letters as the driver recounts the chaos creeping into daily operations. Trucks ran with only half their usual fuel. Tires shredded on rocky terrain. Units that once moved with disciplined precision now traveled in scattered formations to reduce casualties from air attacks. K describes one convoy ambushed near the Tabaga Gap, where a sudden dive bombing run tore through the lead vehicles. He writes that he saw Rmml staring silently at the burning wrecks, unable to hide the shock on his face. For the first time, the driver hints that the commander's composure was faltering. From a historical standpoint, these descriptions align closely with known events from February and early March 1943. Allied aircraft increasingly dominated the skies of southern Tunisia, and German intelligence reports from the time confirmed deep anxiety about the 8th Army's rapid advance. What makes the letters compelling, however, is not merely their accuracy but their emotional clarity. They document not just the collapse of military infrastructure, but the erosion of morale among the staff who were supposed to hold it together. The deeper mystery emerges subtly. K repeatedly mentions secret late-night meetings, officers arriving without insignia, and convoys rerouted at the last minute with no explanation. He notes that Rmml often carried sealed packets that changed hands only in complete privacy. The driver never learned the contents, but he describes the tension surrounding those deliveries as more dangerous than the bombs. Modern historians reading these letters see reflections of the internal fractures within the Axis command during the campaign. Disagreements between Italian and German leaders, conflicting orders from Berlin, and desperate attempts to reorganize defenses against the British advance. But there is something more personal at play, something that eludes easy classification. The letters convey a shadowed sense of urgency, hinting that Rmml possessed information or responsibilities beyond the standard duties of a staff officer. What those responsibilities were remains a matter of debate. The final letter in this sequence ends on a note of rising fear. K writes that he has been told to prepare the vehicle for a dawn departure to the forward line, an unusual request for a senior official. He notes that Rmml seemed agitated, pacing throughout the night. The driver closes by admitting he does not like the feeling in the air, sensing that the next day may bring something irreversible. That letter, brief and unsettling, would be the last from this early batch. And as the intelligence officers set it aside, they were left with the same question that echoes today. What awaited the driver and his mysterious commander on the front lines? In the early weeks of March 1943, the sands of southern Tunisia were alive with movement. Columns of British tanks pressing westward, German engineers detonating charges along the retreat routes, and low-flying Allied aircraft sweeping for targets with relentless precision. Into this tightening vice, the letters of the German driver known only as K continue. And with each new page, Allied analysts at the time noticed something striking. The further the Afrika Korps fell back, the more secretive and strained the behavior around the commander identified only as Rmml became. What had begun as routine transport notes was now slowly becoming the record of a collapse witnessed from the inside. The struggle playing out across the desert landscape was no longer simply tactical. It had become existential. After the British 8th Army's victory at El Alamein the previous November, Montgomery's forces advanced nearly 1,400 miles across Libya. By February 1943, they had reached the formidable defensive system of the Mareth Line, reinforced by German and Italian units determined to delay the British advance at all costs. K found himself driving between these defensive positions, transporting his superior to meetings where officers from the 15th Panzer Division, the 90th Light Division, and remnants of the Italian XXI Corps debated strategies for holding back the Allies. One letter describes a visit to the Mareth Line on March 3. K writes of the sharp contrast between the imposing fortifications carved into the earth and the quiet despair of the soldiers who occupied them. He recounts hearing a Panzer Grenadier remark that the Mareth Line, though strong on paper, was built for a different war, too old, too rigid for what is coming. The driver notes that Rmml remained unusually silent during the inspection, refusing even to engage with subordinate officers unless required. The commander's behavior puzzled the Allied analysts who later read these words. They knew most high-ranking officers of the Afrika Korps by name, and the omission of even a hint made Rmml all the more enigmatic. The letters from this period also uncover the driver's growing fear of Allied air power. He writes of convoys forced to travel at dusk or under moonless skies to avoid the hawks of the desert, a reference to the RAF's P-40 Kitty Hawks and the U.S. Army Air Force A-20 Havocs. One convoy, he reports, was ambushed near the Wadi Zigzag when a formation of Kitty Hawks appeared without warning. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and lacking fuel, could rarely offer escort protection by this point in the campaign. The moment we hear the engines, he writes, every man dives for the dirt. But I must remain in the truck. I must be ready in case the commander needs to move. The insights gained from these letters match the historical record precisely. Allied dominance in the air during this stage of the campaign crippled German mobility. Vehicle shortages, constant bombing runs, and near-constant reconnaissance flights made even simple supply movements dangerous. But the letters add a human dimension that strategic summaries often overlook. K describes the frustration of junior officers, the hollow eyes of exhausted infantrymen, and the growing sense that the Axis position in Tunisia had become untenable. Then comes a revelation that catches the attention of modern historians. In a letter dated March 8, K mentions that his latest orders rerouted his convoy away from the established supply roads. Instead, he was instructed to take a narrow track through the Matmata Hills, a route usually reserved for small reconnaissance units. When asked why, a staff officer told him the diversion was for operational secrecy. K did not believe it. He describes the atmosphere inside the truck cabin as tight, suffocating, with Rmml checking his documents and sealed packets repeatedly. The driver sensed that the convoy was carrying something more sensitive than messages or personnel. What that could have been remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding this narrative. Historical context offers intriguing possibilities. By early March, German commanders were desperately coordinating counterattacks and last-ditch maneuvers against Montgomery's forces, including the failed counterstrike at Medellin on March 6, an operation that resulted in heavy Axis losses. The failure of that attack is echoed in K's letters. He describes the bitterness radiating from the officers after receiving casualty reports. He recalls overhearing one officer mutter, "Nothing left to throw at them. Nothing left at all." He also notes that Rmml spent several hours in heated discussions behind closed doors that night, pacing like a man holding competing orders. K ends this set of letters with a detail that later puzzled Allied analysts. The final sentence before the break reads, "We have been told to move the commander closer to the front. I do not understand this." Senior officers rarely position themselves near active fighting unless preparing for an evacuation or concealing something. The letters stop abruptly here, leaving behind only questions. Why was Rmml ordered toward the front rather than away from it? What was contained in the sealed packets the driver guarded so carefully? And why did the convoy take a remote, dangerous route instead of the established supply road? For now, the story pauses on the eve of something significant, something that would shift the tone of the letters entirely when they resumed weeks later. In March 1943, as the desert heat of southern Tunisia intensified, a sense of impending collapse settled over the remnants of the Afrika Korps. Yet in the middle of this large-scale unraveling, the private letters of the German driver known only as K shift sharply in tone, quiet routine giving way to fear, suspicion, and abrupt changes in orders that even seasoned intelligence officers would later struggle to interpret. The gap between the earlier letters and those that resume weeks later is one of the most puzzling elements of the archive. What happened in that missing time? And why did the next letter begin in a drastically different voice? K's letter dated March 18 begins not with his usual report of routes or personnel, but with something far more unsettling. "I have been assigned to transport the commander to the forward line for reasons I have not been told." He notes that such an assignment was entirely out of character for a man of Rmml's rank, whoever he truly was. Traditionally, senior officers operated behind the defensive positions around the Mareth line or within the administrative centers in Garbes. The decision to move one so close to the front hinted either at a crisis or a secretive operation that required tight control. Either possibility left the driver deeply uneasy. The struggle documented in this phase of the letters mirrors the broader strategic desperation of the Axis forces. By mid-March, Montgomery's 8th Army had begun probing attacks along the Mareth line, and aerial reconnaissance indicated the British were preparing a major offensive. Meanwhile, the German High Command shifted reserves in frantic attempts to counter multiple Allied threats. K describes scenes that reflect the historical record almost exactly. Long columns of infantry trudging through dust storms, armored units digging into improvised positions, engineers rushing to reinforce bunkers originally built by the French decades earlier. Even as the defenses stiffened, the Axis command structure appeared increasingly fractured. During the drive toward the front, K reports witnessing an argument between two staff officers over whether the convoy should divert through a dry wadi to avoid Allied artillery range. The dispute ended when Rmml himself intervened, speaking in a clipped, almost nervous manner that the driver had never heard before. He gave orders quickly, the driver writes, as if he feared being watched. For Allied historians examining these letters later, this single moment offered a rare insight. A senior officer under pressure, aware that the situation was deteriorating faster than headquarters would admit publicly. The tactical challenge of that day soon became clear. As they approached the outskirts of Medellin, the convoy halted abruptly. A sudden burst of machine gun fire echoed from the direction of the forward trenches. K writes that he ducked instinctively, shielding his eyes from sand kicked up by the firing. Several officers leapt from the vehicles, scanning the horizon with field glasses. It was not a British attack, but rather German units repositioning under the confusion of a localized skirmish. The chaos of the front had begun to bleed backward into the roads and supply lines themselves. In a rare moment of personal reflection, K includes an observation that would later capture the attention of the Allied analysts. "I saw the commander watching the men in the trenches with a look I cannot describe. It was not fear, not anger, something else. The mystery of Rmml deepens here. Was he considering an unsanctioned action? Was he evaluating a failing position? Or was he, like many officers in the closing stages of the North African campaign, quietly acknowledging defeat long before it was officially spoken aloud? The next paragraph of the letter contains a chilling revelation. The convoy received sudden last-minute orders directing them to reroute toward the Tobaga Gap, bypassing the expected defensive headquarters entirely. No reason given, the driver wrote, only urgency. This aligns with historical movements. By mid-March, the Germans were aware that Montgomery intended to outflank the Mareth line via the Tobaga Gap in what became Operation Supercharge 2. The repositioning of Rmml could have been related to these preparations, but the secrecy surrounding his movement suggests his role was not typical of conventional command staff. K ends the letter with a sense of foreboding unlike anything in earlier entries. I do not know why we have been sent here. Something is wrong. That line would soon resonate even more powerfully. The next letter begins after a noticeable gap in dates. It is shorter, harsher, written in a hurried scroll. K describes increased tension among the staff accompanying Rmml, noting arguments over miscommunication from higher headquarters and fears that their position could be encircled. He mentions a sealed envelope that the commander instructed him to guard, with my life, until they reached a specific unnamed contact. The driver admits he could not sleep that night. The letter ends abruptly with a sentence that troubled Allied analysts for months. Tomorrow I am to take him to a point dangerously close to the British line. I do not understand what purpose this serves, and he will not tell me. Once again, the letters go silent. And as this third part of the record closes, the sense of mystery, of something concealed within the confusion of collapsing front lines, grows stronger. Whatever happened next would fundamentally change the tone of everything that followed. When the letters resume in early April 1943, they do so with a different voice, one marked by exhaustion, resignation, and an unshakable sense that the desert was closing in on the remnants of the Afrika Korps. The tone is darker, sharper, as if the driver known only as K has crossed an invisible boundary between order and chaos. Weeks have passed since his last entry. During that silence, the Germans have suffered a major setback at the Tobaga Gap, and Montgomery's Operation Supercharge 2 has punched through the flank of the Mareth line. It is within this climate of rapid collapse that K's writing takes on a revealing urgency. The first letter after the gap opens with a startling line. Everything has changed since the last time I wrote. He describes how their convoy barely escaped Allied air attacks while retreating north toward Gobes. It is here that he notes a detail that stands out to modern historians: the confusion among units that once prided themselves on precision. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division, the 164th Light Africa Division, and surviving Italian Bersaglieri were scattered, out of contact, and moving without cohesive command. K writes that the desert roads were no longer controlled. They were simply paths of survival, shared by soldiers who had lost any sense of central direction. Perhaps most striking is his depiction of Rmml. Once withdrawn but composed, the commander now appears gaunt, intensely focused, yet unsettled. The driver notes that he rarely slept, spending long nights reviewing maps by the glow of a shielded lamp. In one entry, K remembers waking to find Rmml pacing outside the truck in near-total darkness, muttering about lost positions and delayed instructions. When asked whether he should prepare the vehicle for immediate movement, the commander only replied, "Not yet. There is something I must see with my own eyes." These glimpses of anxiety reflect the broader struggle within German command during April 1943. Internal disagreements over withdrawal routes, conflicting messages from Berlin, and the deteriorating cooperation between German and Italian officers all contributed to the chaos. K captures this tension not through political analysis but through the sights and sounds of daily survival. He recounts heated arguments among staff officers about whether to retreat toward Enfidaville or consolidate defensive lines around Sfax. One evening, he overhears an officer slam his fist against an ammunition crate and shout, "The orders are impossible. No fuel, no air cover, no time. Historical records confirm that fuel shortages were crippling by this stage. Luftwaffe aircraft were often grounded, and many German vehicles were abandoned for lack of petrol. K describes this vividly, noting that he was instructed to siphon fuel from damaged trucks, some still smoldering from recent raids, in order to keep the commander's vehicle operational. The smell of burnt rubber clings to everything, he writes, as if the desert itself is burning. Yet amidst these logistical challenges, the letters introduce a revealing insight. Rumors circulating within the Afrika Korps about a disagreement between senior German commanders. K mentions overhearing that General von Arnim and other officers clashed over defensive strategies, while Italian commanders complained of being left unsupported. He does not fully understand the political implications, but he senses that the infighting is affecting the movements of Rmml. The driver notes that their convoys took increasingly irregular routes, avoiding main headquarters and conducting brief, hushed meetings at improvised shelters far from established command posts. One of the most intriguing sections of the letter describes a sudden, unexplained trip ordered by Rmml to a forward artillery position near the Jebel Dahar range. K writes that the commander demanded to speak privately with the battery officers, staying only a few minutes before returning to the truck. When the driver asked what the visit had been about, Rmml gave no response. Allied analysts later speculated that these movements might have been linked to last-ditch defensive planning, but the secrecy still raises questions. As British forces pushed closer to the Tunisian coastal plain, morale within the Axis ranks deteriorated further. K describes seeing streams of wounded soldiers moving back from the front, some carried on makeshift stretchers, others limping alone, uniforms shredded by shrapnel. He notes that their expressions haunted him. Faces of men who know the end is near. In another entry, he recounts passing an Italian column where a young officer stared blankly into the sand, holding a map that no longer meant anything. These human images provide rare emotional clarity to the historical record. The letters grow increasingly introspective. The driver questions why Rmml maintains such an irregular schedule, making short, mysterious trips to forward positions while other senior officers consolidate for retreat. K wonders if the commander hopes to gather intelligence, deliver secret messages, or seek confirmation of something he has not shared. The ambiguity becomes one of the central mysteries of the archive. The part ends on a moment of tension. K writes, "Tonight, he ordered me to keep the engine ready. He says we may need to move without warning. I do not know where we will go next." It is a line that speaks to both logistical uncertainty and something deeper, a sense that Rmml is navigating his own private crisis as the Afrika Korps edges toward destruction. And in the coming days, that crisis would sharpen dramatically. By April 1943, the Axis position in Tunisia was no longer collapsing. It was unraveling in slow motion, thread by thread, convoy by convoy. The letters from the German driver known as K now read like dispatches from a sinking ship, each one capturing the tension, desperation, and confusion of soldiers trapped in a shrinking pocket of resistance. What had once been a structured force with defined supply lines and defensive lines was reduced to a fractured collection of scattered units, broken communications, and improvised orders. It is against this backdrop that one of the central mysteries of the archive emerges: the disappearance of the commander known only by the cryptic title Rmml. The opening of K's April 20th letter sets the stage for what follows. Everything is collapsing behind us. We are no longer following orders. We are trying to survive them. He describes a landscape filled with the remnants of retreat. Burned-out half-tracks litter the roads. Abandoned artillery pieces sit in the sand like stranded skeletons. And everywhere, the sound of Allied aircraft dominates the skies. By this point, the British 8th Army and US II Corps had tightened their grip, pushing Axis forces steadily toward Tunis and Bizerta. Allied dominance in the air prevented any daylight movement, forcing German and Italian convoys to travel under moonless skies. K writes that when dawn broke, they often found themselves dangerously exposed, racing for any cover they could find. This uncertainty reaches a new peak when K receives orders to prepare the vehicle for a nighttime evacuation of senior personnel. The evacuation is described in haunting detail. Officers from different commands, some German, some Italian, arrive at the assembly point, arguing in low, urgent tones. Maps are spread across the hood of a vehicle illuminated only by a shielded flashlight. K overhears two officers debating whether they should brake toward Enfidaville or attempt a riskier route north to Pont du Fas. Fuel was scarce, Allied patrols were everywhere, and the risk of capture had become almost inevitable. Yet despite all this uncertainty, Rmml insists on joining the group. At first, the letters suggest little unusual. K describes the usual signs of strain among the convoy: the tense silence, the quick, clipped orders, the way officers flinched at distant artillery. But then a series of contradictions appears. The convoy receives conflicting instructions from different headquarters, one telling them to head west, another directing them east toward the coast. K writes, "Every few hours, the plan changed. We were told to turn back, then told to press forward. No one seemed to know where the safe positions were anymore." This confusion reflects the historical reality of late April 1943. The Axis command structure had fractured under pressure. Communication lines were overloaded or cut. Retreat routes were blocked or overrun. German and Italian units frequently moved at cross purposes. K's account of contradictory orders matches the chaos documented by Allied intelligence after the war. But amid this confusion, a moment occurs that becomes central to the mystery of Rmml. According to the driver's account, the convoy is halted near a dried wadi east of Bu Fisha. Several officers gather for a brief meeting. When they return, Rmml approaches K and instructs him to refuel the truck and prepare for immediate departure, but not with the convoy. Instead, he orders a separate route, one that diverges sharply from the group's planned escape path. K writes that he hesitated. Desertion from the convoy was dangerous, and nearly impossible to justify without explicit documentation. But Rmml hands him a sealed packet and says only, "This must reach the next command post. We will go alone." The driver admits he felt uneasy but obeyed. It is here that historians find the first indications that Rmml was acting outside the standard chain of command. Minutes later, however, another officer intercepts them, stating that the convoy's orders have changed again. All senior personnel are to proceed together toward the coastal fallback line near Hammamet. The driver describes the scene: shouting, finger-pointing, demands for identification codes. Rmml, usually quiet and reserved, becomes visibly agitated. He insists the diversion is essential. The officer refuses. The confrontation ends abruptly when an Allied aircraft is spotted overhead and everyone scatters for cover. When the convoy regroups after the attack, something has changed. Rmml is no longer with them. K writes in a shaken hand, "I looked everywhere, behind the dunes, near the trucks, among the officers. But he was gone. No one saw him leave." This disappearance becomes the turning point for the final letters. The driver confesses he does not know whether Rmml fled, was taken by another unit, or was struck during the chaos of the air raid. But the sealed packet he carried is still in his possession, untouched, unclaimed. "I held it in my hands and felt the weight of it," he writes. Whatever it contains, it was important enough for him to risk the desert alone. The part ends with an ominous observation: rumors are spreading. Some say officers are abandoning their posts. Some say they are being captured. Others say they are disappearing by choice. The mystery of Rmml is now fully formed. And in the final letters, written from the crumbling outskirts of Tunis, the tension reaches its breaking point. The final letters from the driver, known only as K, emerge from the outskirts of Tunis in late April and early May 1943. Days marked by confusion, desperation, and the gradual realization that the Afrika Korps was facing its end. The tone is unmistakably changed. Gone is the mechanical discipline of earlier entries. Gone is the cautious optimism. In its place is a blunt, almost hollow voice. a man witnessing the last breath of a failing army, recording what he sees even as his own fate becomes uncertain. These final documents would later puzzle Allied intelligence officers, not only for what they describe, but for how abruptly they stop. The last sequence begins with a stark line: "The sky does not belong to us anymore." K describes constant Allied patrols over the collapsing Tunisian pocket, RAF Spitfires and US P-38 Lightnings cutting wide circles over retreating Axis forces. Vehicles could no longer move in daylight without risking instant destruction. Even at night, movement was difficult. Roads were clogged with wrecks, sand drifts, and retreating columns that had lost their officers. K notes passing a long line of Italian artillerymen walking silently along the roadside, pulling a single undamaged 75mm gun by hand. "They did not look at us," he writes. "They looked only forward, as if refusing to see what was behind them." It is amidst this grim backdrop that K returns to the disappearance of the commander known as Rmml. The driver reports asking every officer he encounters whether they have seen the commander. Some claim they do not recognize the name. Others seem to recall a senior staff officer who vanished during a retreat near Bu Fisha. One German lieutenant even suggests that some officers have taken to discarding their uniforms to avoid capture. But none can confirm the fate of Rmml. This lack of information is significant, reflecting the state of Axis command at this stage: fragmented, isolated, and overwhelmed by the pace of the Allied advance. The most revealing passage appears in a letter dated April 29th. K writes, "The packet he gave me is still in my pack. No one has asked for it. I do not know where to bring it." He describes inspecting the exterior of the sealed envelope, noting that it bears no insignia, only a handwritten set of initials and a date. He wonders whether it contains orders, intelligence documents, or personal correspondence. The envelope becomes symbolic, a physical link to the commander he cannot find and a responsibility he cannot fulfill. From a historical standpoint, these dates align almost perfectly with the Axis collapse. In late April, German forces retreated to the defensive lines near Enfidaville under General von Arnim. Fuel shortages were catastrophic. Ammunition stocks were nearly depleted, and Allied pressure from both land and air was unrelenting. The confusion that K describes matches British and American field reports from the final days of the campaign. One of the most haunting portions of the archive describes a night movement toward Tunis. K recounts driving through a landscape illuminated only by distant fires. He passes broken columns of infantry who have run out of ammunition, men searching abandoned vehicles for water, and officers burning documents in shallow pits before retreating. "The desert has become a cemetery for machines," he writes. "Everywhere metal dies, and men die with it." During this movement, K describes hearing a rumor that a group of senior officers attempted to escape toward the coast using a fishing vessel. Another rumor claims that a secret evacuation point existed south of Tunis for individuals carrying intelligence documents bound for Sicily. Whether Rmml intended to reach such a point, or whether he ever did, remains one of the unanswered questions that Allied analysts could not resolve. The emotional climax of the letters comes in an entry dated May 5th. British artillery had begun shelling the approaches to Tunis. K writes, "I do not know why I continue writing. Perhaps to leave behind something in case I am found." He mentions that he has considered opening the sealed packet but cannot bring himself to do it. Then comes the final letter. It is short, barely half a page, written in an unsteady hand. "We are in the last streets leading into Tunis. The city is choking with vehicles that can no longer move. Smoke covers everything. I have asked again for news of the commander, but no one knows him or will admit to it. I am keeping the packet. I will try to reach a rear position tonight. If I cannot, I will bury it." He ends with a sentence that Allied intelligence officers would read again and again. "If these are my last words, then let it be known that I tried." After this, the letters stop. No final note. No captured personnel report. No body recovered. No confirmation of what became of K or of Rmml. the archive simply ends. When British forces entered Tunis on May 7, 1943, they found thousands of surrendering soldiers, piles of abandoned equipment, and scattered documents. But the sealed packet mentioned in the letters was never logged among the material recovered in the aftermath. Its contents remain unknown. And so the story of Rmml's driver concludes not with resolution, but with silence, a reflection of the countless individual fates lost in the chaos of the North African campaign's final days. The mystery endures, echoing through the driver's last uncertain words. And the sealed packet, somewhere in the desert or destroyed in the chaos of retreat, remains an unanswered question that history may never fully solve.